Well, joining us for a discussion on how the changing climate has been contributing to severe rains and cyclones currently being experienced in southern Africa is Thandile Chinyavanhu, who's a climate and energy campaigner. Thanks very much indeed for joining us, Thandile. What we're seeing at the moment, is it unusual for this time of the year? I know that it should be a little bit cold because we're going into winter, but these rains, are these unusual?
Good evening, Peter, and thank you so much for having me. I think it's certainly unusual for this level of precipitation that we're witnessing, much like we saw at the end of last year during the festive season between December and early January this year, which is usually our rainy season. We saw an unprecedented amount of rain, and that is more than we've seen in the last couple of years. And this is demonstrated by the fact that our systems, particularly our drainage systems, are unable to manage with the amount of rain that we're receiving. And I think a lot of the public can really see that. So this is definitely not usual.
And is this something that's been trending upwards over a period of time, so that a few years ago we started to notice more frequencies such as what we're seeing?
Definitely, and I think a lot of people across South Africa in different regions are definitely being able to recognize the difference in not only the precipitation patterns, but also the living conditions that they were in as a result of the climate around them. More people experiencing drought, especially on the eastern parts of the country, in parts of the Western Cape as well. But there's definitely a huge change that people are witnessing, even with the agriculture and when certain plants would flower. So there's definitely been a change, and people are definitely recognizing that.
And it's not just South Africa though, is it? I mean, it seems to be the region. We've seen extreme weather. I think you mentioned the droughts, which is the other side of these flash floods that we're experiencing.
So Greenpeace Africa, that is definitely the case. And Greenpeace Africa did release a report in 2020, basically looking at extreme weather events across not only the sub-Saharan African region, but Africa as a whole. And there was definitely a correlation between climate change and some of these extreme weather events that we are witnessing, and a number of issues that were raised there concerning flooding, droughts in certain parts of the continent. And we're definitely starting to see those taking place and shape now more evidently than we were able to before for the general public. And that's been demonstrated with the recent announcement by the UN about the possibility of famine in Somalia. So the situation there was quite dire already, but a number of climate shocks and a lack of rain seasons for the past 3 seasons has resulted in a major humanitarian crisis. And this is something that's going to become more pervasive across the continent as the trajectory of greenhouse gas emissions continues to rise.
So right now, what are you predicting? What are we going to see, and in what areas?
Well, the reports that have been released by the IPCC, both last year as well as the most recent ones on the 28th of February, as well as in March, they've revealed that we're going to see a lot more changes on the Western Cape of or western coast of South Africa. We're going to be seeing ecological damage, more drought conditions, more wildfires, and on the East Coast we can expect to see higher precipitation and ultimately floods and cyclones, as we've already begun to see in KZN region as well as parts of the Eastern Cape with the recent floods at the end of last year in Tanzania. So those are going to become more common, but we're definitely going to have drought. We've already been experiencing a drought in some provinces for almost 13 years, so that's going to become more pervasive. And unless our government can put in the necessary plans now to alleviate the damage that will ultimately cause, we're going to see a lot of people suffering as a result.
You've mentioned government. What can authorities do more of and start doing going forward?
Well, definitely all eyes are going to be on our government as we approach COP27 this year. And that is really a moment for them to strengthen their emission trajectory as well as their nationally determined contributions. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on that. The government is also opposed to release the Climate Change Act, or ratify it rather. It's currently a bill sitting with Parliament. So that's something that they definitely need to make haste on and ensure that when we go into COP27, we do have a Climate Change Act in place.
There's so much, I suppose, we can do locally here in the region, but I guess some of what's going on actually is happening in other parts of the world, and we are just feeling the consequences of those actions.
Yeah, we definitely are feeling the greatest consequences of those actions. As we've discussed before on your show, the issue is that South Africa is a major emitter of carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases in general, and they have contributed significantly to this. We do understand that there is a common yet differentiated approach that we should be taking to limiting carbon emissions below that 1.5 degrees Celsius target. But ultimately, South Africa's ecological dependency and poor adaptive capacity has made the public more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So they are being felt everywhere, but because of the maladministration that we've been victim to, injustices in the past, we'll definitely feel it a lot worse than maybe more parts of the globe will generally feel it.
Adaptation has been a big issue, partly affording it, but also B, that we need to do it. And we have energy policies that are saying, look, we want to go green, but we can't give up coal just yet. But yet these floods and these droughts are saying that we ought to. And I guess this is the big debate now about how quickly we phase out, if we do at all.
That is definitely the question. But as you mentioned, that it is maybe the coal fundamentalists that have an addiction to coal. And we need to move past that at this point. We need to recognize that if we continue on this trajectory, continue using fossil fuels, then ultimately it will not only cost our lives in the long term, but it is also going to cost the economy, which our government continues to put on a pedestal as the reason why we are not necessarily transitioning away from fossil fuels. But the World Meteorological Organization did release a report last year that basically cited that at the current trajectory, we can expect to see sub-Saharan Africa's GDP contracting by 3%. So while the government might favor the immediate growth that coal could potentially offer us, in the long term, it's going to cost us in our economy as well as in lives.
Thandile Chinyavanhu, we're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much indeed for joining us. And perhaps somebody is listening and that greater urgency happens in terms of taking action, because our poor citizens, ordinary folk on the ground, are the ones that are suffering the most. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.